I take my refuge in the Buddha and pray that with all beings I may understand the great way, whereby the Buddha seed may forever thrive. I take my refuge in the Dharma and pray that with all beings I may enter deeply into the Sutra treasure, whereby our wisdom may grow as vast as the ocean. I take my refuge in the Sangha and pray that with all beings I may reign in great multitudes and have nothing to check the unimpeded progress of truth. So they're going for refuge verses from the Avatamsaka Sutta. I really love those verses, and I thought I'd start with those, partly because we've just been looking at the Dharma verse on the Women's Convention in Berlin, but also because we can't really celebrate the Buddha without celebrating the Dharma and the Sangha. But of course, particularly today, we celebrate the Buddha. Without the Buddha, we wouldn't be here. Without the Buddha, we wouldn't have a Triratna community. We wouldn't have a Triratna order. Without a Buddha, without the Buddha, we wouldn't have the Venerable Sangharakshita, and therefore we wouldn't have our order and our community. So what I want to celebrate today are some of the Buddha's qualities. I want to celebrate the great way which he's opened up. I want to celebrate the radical nature of his community. And I want to celebrate the hope that the Buddha seed may forever thrive. So in terms of the Buddha's qualities, when we talk of the Buddha's qualities, we often think of his wisdom, his compassion, and perhaps his energy, all of which are abundantly displayed in the Pali Canon, all of which are well celebrated in many, many ways. Today I want to celebrate some other qualities of the Buddha. I want to celebrate his equanimity. I want to celebrate the fact that he was a grateful Buddha. And I want to celebrate the fact that he found appropriate, skillful means to teach his way. So equanimity. I think perhaps I'm attracted to this because it's not a quality that I have in abundance. I like to think I have more than I used to have, but I still see it as something to work towards and to practice. So there's a story in the Pali Canon about a woman whose name I can't remember, who fell in love with the Buddha when she met him. And she made advances towards the Buddha. She tried to seduce the Buddha. So he was already the Buddha by this point. So as you might imagine, he was quite immune to her attractiveness. He responded with positive love, but not with the kind of love that she had rather hoped for. So of course she felt rejected. Later she married a king whose name I also can't remember. But the point is he was a king. So she rose to have great influence. And she used her position and her influence to spread nasty rumours and insults about the Buddha and his community. So she told some great big nasty fibs, lies, big tall tales about the Buddha, mainly of a sexual nature. She even pressurized the local authorities to forbid the Buddha to teach in public because she said his ethics were so questionable. Anyway, poor Ananda gets very upset by all this, and he goes to the Buddha and says, I think we should leave Kosambi, we should go somewhere else where they like us. Let's spread the Dharma in a more hospitable place. And the Buddha says, okay, Ananda, and if we go somewhere else and the same thing happens, what do we do then? And Ananda said, well, it's obvious, we move again. And the Buddha says, and what happens if we go somewhere else and something similar happens again? And Ananda says, well, we just keep moving. And the Buddha says, this is not correct, Ananda. We must not become discouraged every time we meet with difficulties. Solutions should be found in the very midst of our hardships. Ananda, if we practice equanimity, we will not be bothered by insults and slander. So the reason why I quite like this story is I think it's so easy to react. And it's particularly easy to react when something seems unfair or unjust. When we're accused of something that we don't feel we've ever done, it's very hard to remain equanimous in the face of this. Anyway, the Buddha says something really interesting. He says, people who slander do not harm us, they harm only themselves. When a man spits at the sky, spits at the sky is not sullied by the spit. The spit falls back in the face of the man who spat. It's a great image, isn't it? I'll just demonstrate in case any of you who don't have English as a first language are struggling with my Glaswegian accent. Okay, so if you spit at the sky, I won't actually do it, but what happens is the sky remains the blue sky, but the spit comes back and dribbles down your face. So I think there might be a lesson in this. I feel it's so easy for us to polarize. And unfortunately, I think this happens even in our community. So if you read Shabda, which of course you all do, from cover to cover, as well as you all write. I don't know what happens to all these reports that people write to Shabda that obviously get lost somewhere in cyberspace. So if you read Shabda, sometimes it does sound like we're in the midst of various disagreements. One of the things that's great about a conversation cafe, which we're going to do later, is that sometimes you read something in Shabda and then you find yourself at the table with this person who's written something that you felt very upset by, and hey, it's just another person. And when you actually come into communication and relationship, somehow it just changes. We did a conversation cafe at Wyndham quite a few years ago, and I know some of you were there. And it was at a time, I can't remember quite what the particular issue was that people were disagreeing. I think it might have been, what do you call it, not just sitting, pure awareness, I think might have been one of the issues. I mean, why on earth do we get wound up about pure awareness? But anyway, people did. In all sorts of different ways. And one of my friends, who's a public preceptor, he didn't want to come to the conversation cafe. He said, oh, I'm just going to sit and listen to all this rubbish, and some of you can probably guess who this is, actually. He said, I don't want to listen to all these people just slagging off the order. So anyway, he came. I managed to persuade him. And he found himself in the first table with two people whose things in Shabda had been really winding him up, really making him quite angry, or at least, upset. And he said to me afterwards, it was fantastic, because talking to that person, I suddenly heard what he really wanted to say. Behind the complaints, as it were, what he could hear was this love of the order. And I really tried to hear that. You know, for those of you that know, non-violent communication, really try and read Shabda with your giraffe ears. you know, where you're really trying to translate, in a sense, what you're reading. Rather than polarising and reacting to what we read, my own practice is to try and read behind and just think, well, if somebody's complaining, it's probably because they love the order and they really do want to see the order functioning in a way that really works. Anyway, I just thought that the thing about spit kind of seemed quite interesting, because sometimes I do feel like I'm being spat upon when I read some things about the college and public preceptors, because I am a public preceptor in the college, so it's hard sometimes to read things and just think, okay, it's no. And I don't mean just genuine criticisms, because I think that's absolutely fair enough, but sometimes it does feel a little bit like there's a bit more behind it, maybe, than that. Anyway, I tried to learn from that. I tried to just think, it doesn't help to react and respond by polarising. And I think this is true not only in an individual sense when we read things, but it's so easy to kind of fall into camps and groups. Even within a spiritual community, it's kind of very easy to think us and them. And I think for the future of the order, it's great if we can really try not to fall into that us and them mentality. And of course, maybe I'm speaking completely to the converted, and nobody here ever falls into any kind of us and them mentality. I bow to you. Another little thing about equanimity that the Buddha says, you'll remember the sutra where Rahula, his son, is walking behind the Buddha. I think of it as the what if sutra. So Rahula is walking behind his dad, and he's thinking, if he hadn't left home, I could be a universal monarch. So again, I think this is something that we can fall into, the kind of what if mentality. And the Buddha knows what Rahula's thinking, which must be slightly disconcerting. And he turns round and he says to Rahula, he stops Rahula and he admonishes him in public. So poor Rahula's quite upset. And he goes off and he sits under a tree to regain his mindfulness. And later the Buddha sees that his mindfulness is restored, and he thinks Rahula's ready for a teaching. So he says to Rahula, learn from the earth, Rahula. Whether people spread pure and fragrant flowers, perfume, fresh milk on it, or if they discard filthy and foul-smelling feces. Does everybody understand feces? Urine, blood, mucus, and spit. Seems to be a rather visceral talk. So the Buddha says, the earth receives all this equally without clinging or aversion. When pleasant or unpleasant thoughts arise, don't let them entangle or enslave you. So again, I think in terms of learning from this equanimous approach to life, to just really recognise what arises and what passes, and it does pass. So just recognising whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, it will not last forever. It is not me, it is not mine. Okay, so I won't go into the rest of that sutta where he talks about all the elements. But I think the important thing is just to recognise that no clinging and no aversion allows us to live in the moment with love and compassion. Okay, so very briefly, I want to celebrate the Buddha's skillful means, his upaya. So there's lots and lots of stories that can reflect that. But the one that I'm sure everybody knows is the story of Kisa Gotami. So Kisa Gotami, you'll remember, has lost her only child. He's died. And she has tried to find some medicine to heal this child. And she goes to all sorts of people, and they say to her, But woman, this child is dead. Lay down this child. But she's so overcome by grief that she just cannot accept this. And eventually she goes to the Buddha and she says the same thing to him. Please, can you cure my child? Can you heal my child? And the Buddha doesn't say to her, woman, this child is dead. He says, yes, I can. I can heal this. And he sends her off to find a mustard seed. You remember? This mustard seed must come from a home where no one has ever died. And of course, she cannot find a home where no one has ever died. Everywhere she goes, she's told the same thing. In this home, the dead are many and the living are few. And she eventually returns to the Buddha and she says, I recognize death comes to everything, to everybody. Impermanence comes to everybody. And she's able to lay down her dead baby and she becomes one of the Buddha's foremost disciples. And in the end, she becomes an arahant. But the Buddha used skillful means with her. He didn't say to her, oh, for heaven's sake, this baby's dead. And he didn't jump straight to giving her a teaching on impermanence. And I think that's quite important. He gave her an appropriate response. He allowed her to really feel her grief. And then through her grief, open up to the universal truth of impermanence. Had he said to her, that child's dead, all conditioned phenomena arise in dependence, and with the changing of those conditions, all phenomena die, become a Buddhist. Or, he didn't say Buddhist, but, come and join my community. There's no way she could have done that. She could never have heard that teaching. So I think this is something for us to also think of in terms of us as a community and a movement, how we teach, how we approach people, and that we do that by really knowing what's needed in that other person's life at this moment. In the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutta, there's also talk of conquering all dharmas. And I've always really liked that. And Bhante's talk on that, where he talks about really learning to teach the Dharma in appropriate language. So that isn't just learning to teach it in your own language, but to teach it in a language that can be heard. And I'm actually pretty sure that if I'd first stumbled upon the FWBO, as it was, outside Glasgow, I'm not completely sure I would have heard it. There was something about hearing it in my own language, and I don't just mean Glaswegian, but people who spoke a language that I really got, I really understood. So I think it's important for us to know, and also in a way to know what's appropriate in the world today. You can't just keep teaching like we were in the 1970s or the 1980s or even the 1990s. So I think it's good to know what's available in our society. And of course, the whole mindfulness movement, there's a lot could be said about that. And that as a bridge to meet people. But also, I heard Bhikkhu Bodhi giving a talk a few years back. And he was saying he was worried about it becoming the Buddha's noble one-fold path. Which I thought was quite interesting. So we do teach mindfulness. We can teach that in secular contexts, but actually what we have to offer is the Buddha Dharma, and it's so much more radical. So personally, I think it's great that we're teaching mindfulness and that we're in the world and that we're responding to people's needs. And I think it's important to do it as Buddhists. Anyway, the Buddha was a grateful Buddha. This is the next quality that I want to focus on and celebrate. So you'll recall that after the Buddha's enlightenment, he stayed under the Bodhi tree for some time, absorbing the impact of his experience. And then we're told, sometimes it says it's after 7 days, Who knows really, but at some point he stood up, he walked 50 meters away from the Bodhi tree, he turned around and he bowed to the tree, and he expressed his gratitude to the tree for having sheltered him as he struggled through those last moments on the threshold of enlightenment. So Bhante gave a talk many years ago where he says, the newly enlightened Buddha is a grateful Buddha. I think that's just beautiful. The newly enlightened Buddha is a grateful Buddha. And again, it's something Bhante really appreciates. He says he gets so much gratitude. People come and visit him. By the way, talking about Bhante, just to let you know, he is very well at the moment. He's in very good form. He's seeing quite a lot of people again after having had a period of not seeing people. His memory is as good as ever. His memory is better than mine. He doesn't seem to have any short-term or long-term memory loss, as far as I can tell. He reminds me of things that I promised to do and haven't yet done. In fact, I had an email only the other day reminding me of something that I had said I would do and I hadn't done. So yeah, he's in good form. And he said often when people come to see him, all they want to do is say thank you. They just want to acknowledge what a difference his life has made to their life. And I was talking to him about this a few years ago, still in Birmingham, and he was saying that he thinks gratitude is a quality that is becoming lost in the West. That he wonders whether there's a rise of cynicism, and that as cynicism arises, gratitude correspondingly falls. That actually you cannot hold gratitude and cynicism together very easily. So he thought, as an antidote to the rise of cynicism, we could actively develop our gratitude. So I've again been just trying to remember that. And it's so easy. And again, partly temperamentally, I have such a critical mind. I mean, I have a painfully critical mind. Those of you that know me and have worked and lived with me over the years will know this to be true. And so I can very easily, you know the expression, pick holes? I can very easily find exactly what has not worked well in any given situation. It's like it jumps out at me. So I really try and make a practice of saying, okay, I can see that hasn't worked very well. Let it go. What has worked well? So it's a practice, and sometimes it comes more easily than others. But I like to try and remember that little phrase, the newly enlightened Buddha was a grateful Buddha. So maybe a struggling bodhisattva can be a grateful bodhisattva. Another quality related to this gratitude, you'll remember the Buddha also looked for something to revere. So Bhante says, I think in the same talk, the newly enlightened Buddha was a devotional Buddha. So the Buddha looks for something to feel devotion towards. In the Garava Sutta, you find him looking around and trying to find a sage, a wise person, somebody that he can look up to and revere. And in the end, the only thing he finds he can revere is the Dharma. So he reveres the Dharma. Obviously, this isn't the Dharma in terms of his teaching, because he's only enlightened, he hasn't even started to teach yet. So what is it that he's revering and devoting himself towards? It's the eternal law, the Dharma as the eternal law of impermanence and insubstantiality. The Buddha is seeing Paticcasamuppada. That was his enlightenment experience. And so he reveres that eternal law, that universal law. And he reveres it because his experience is because he has reopened the way to that experience for others. Which brings us to the way. I wanted to celebrate the way in that verse that I read at the beginning. You'll remember it talks of the way. So the Buddha refound the way. He found the way to liberation and to freedom. He opened the gateways of liberation, the gateways of impermanence, of insubstantiality, of dukkha. Through those lakshanas, the Buddha gave us the opportunity to see and penetrate reality and open ourselves up into the gateways of liberation, which is just such a wonderful gift. So the Buddha's quality of liberation, as we know, he taught that the Dharma has but one taste, the taste of liberation. So we should feel freer. To the extent that we practice the Dharma, we should feel that we are casting off and breaking all the things that hold us and tie us to being small. So I want to celebrate not only liberation, but the radical nature of that liberation and the radical nature of the Buddha's community. So I've given a number of talks fairly recently on this topic. I'm terribly pleased with myself, actually, if I may say so. About a month ago, I gave a talk in New York, which was streamed live across the internet. I wasn't particularly proud of the talk. The talk was all right, but I was rather proud of the fact that I was sitting in Manhattan and I was being listened to in Australia and England and other bits of America. I just think it's great that we've got that sort of technology and we can do that. Anyway, so I gave a talk called Radical Then, Radical Now, and I was looking at the nature of the Buddha's radicalness, radicality, at Bhante as a radical figure in setting up our movement, and also why is the Dharma still the radical alternative for the world's problems. So it was recorded, if people are interested, and there's been a whole series of other talks recently. Vadika gave a talk along similar lines at Adhisthana recently, and Dhammadinna Kemasuri and I did some talks on the same topic. So there's quite a lot of talks recently around the radical nature of the Dharma. I'd like to just mention two things that the Buddha did in the creation of his community, which were for their time extremely radical. So one of these was that he admitted women to the order. So I know that there's all sorts of stories around how he admitted women to the order, and we have his aunt and stepmother, Gautami, to thank for that she, it says 500 of her followers. I think 500 is just a kind of, it means a lot of. So she and a lot of her followers wanted to take refuge with the Buddha and become bhikkhunis. I'm sure you all know the story. Eventually the Buddha does admit them to the monastic community, but he gives them some extra precepts to follow. It's hard to know whether the Buddha really did give them those extra precepts or whether that's an addition that came later through the monastic Sangha. If you think of where the monastic Sangha blossomed through the ages, in some of those countries, they're not particularly feminist. They're not even particularly, they don't even have particularly good records on women's rights or, even just the most fundamental freedom for women. So who knows really why those rules came into existence. But the fact of the matter was that he let women into the community, and he made it very clear in response to Ananda's questioning that women could in fact achieve or attain exactly the same stages that any man could. That might not sound very radical, sitting in a room in a combined order that's got men and women with equal ordination, and in a world where most of us live in conditions where women do more or less have the same opportunities as men. But just even India today, our community is quite radical. There's this wonderful moment etched in my mind from our international convention in Bodh Gaya in 2009, where I know some of you were there. And there's a moment where Jnana Shuri, who's an Indian woman public preceptor, who's from the Dalit community, is leading the prostration practice. Oh. I still feel quite emotional when I think about this. So she's sitting under the Bodhi tree, leading the prostration practice, and there's a community of men and women, Western and Indian, prostrating behind her. That's amazing. That is amazing even today in India. And the amount of people who were taking photographs was quite extraordinary. And people were coming and asking and looking at it. They were just amazed. You know, we'd all sorts of people asking us questions about this. So think in the day of the Buddha, how radical it was for the Buddha to admit women to his community. The other thing was his adamant dismissal or rejection of the caste system. So there's a lovely little story which I told the other day in a talk I gave in Berlin. So there's a lovely little story where I think it's 5 Brahmin youth come along to the Buddha to be admitted to the community. And they bring their manservant with them. So the Buddha sends the 5 Brahmin youth off to do something. I can't remember what. And while they're away, he ordains the manservant. So this means the manservant will always be the senior to the 5 Brahmin youth. That's great, isn't it? So that's, again, quite radical. So when they came back and they took their ordination, they had to bow to their ex-manservant. And again, I mean, even these days, things, although the caste system is not admitted in law, you just need to talk to any of our order members in India who come from that background to know that it's still prevalent. You know, they're still struggling and fighting against casteism, particularly the women, I think, with the sort of double, you know, caste and being women. So there are 2 things that the Buddha did in his day which were truly radical. And there's also quite a lot, there's more social analysis in the Pali Canon than we sometimes think. So I'm not going to go into that. Again, I've talked about it recently, Vadika's talked about it recently, and I believe Vadika goes into some of this in his book, which we will be getting the opportunity to buy later, I believe, in the convention. So it's worth kind of reading some of those things. There's a lovely sutta where the Buddha talks about the Nidana chain, which all of us are very familiar with in terms of one personality. But he also talks about it as a social phenomenon and how hoarding gives rise to stinginess, etc. And when it comes to the end, it says, and this gives rise to violence, to the lifting of sticks and the throwing of stones. So he does analyse social issues. So our community is also radical, but it could be radicaler, which doesn't exist in English, but it could be more radical. And I think one of the tasks that we have as people ordained at this moment in history, while Sangharakshita is still alive, while we still have the opportunity to speak to him, come together with him, listen to him, and perhaps still have a cohesive order, in part because of his continued life, is I think it's really important that we think what our community looks like and how to keep it radical. You know, I think we still can. I think we can be a radical force for good in the world, but frankly, I'm not always convinced that we are. In the Dasadhamma Sutta, that sutta begins by saying, I no longer live according to worldly aims and values. This should be reflected upon again and again by one who has gone forth. I no longer live according to worldly aims and values. So maybe a question that we can ask ourselves is this true? Do I no longer live according to worldly aims and values? That doesn't mean that we don't live in the world or we don't use iPhones or iPads. Right, maybe it does mean that actually. But I think it really means looking very seriously at the values by which we live in. Samsara is seductive. Samsara is powerful, seemingly beautiful. It pulls us in. We really must fight against that urge. We really must find a way to stay radical in our personal practice and in our collective practice, because the world needs the Dharma more than ever. So the verse says that the Buddha seed may forever thrive. So what are we doing to make sure the Buddha seed may forever thrive? Of course, there are many communities in which the Buddha seed is thriving. There are many practitioners inside and outside communities, in ours and in others, who are doing everything they can to make sure that the Buddha seed may thrive. It's so important we don't become complacent. The Buddha seed needs water and sunshine. It needs rain. It needs to be constantly cultivated, which doesn't mean pulling it up to see if it's growing. You know, if you pull a seed up to have a look, it doesn't do it much good. So we can trust that we've got those Buddha seeds. We can have confidence in celebrating our own Buddha seeds. But we must make sure we give them the conditions whereby they will forever thrive. That we give them the conditions that our rain is not tinged with pollution. That the sunshine that's shining upon the Buddha seed is a beautiful sunshine, and that we do everything in our power to make sure that those seeds remain pure and beautiful and grow. So I take my refuge in the Buddha and pray that with all beings I may understand the great way, whereby the Buddha seed may forever thrive. I take my refuge in the Dharma and pray that with all beings I may enter deeply into the Sutra treasure, whereby our wisdom may grow as vast as the ocean. I take my refuge in the Sangha and pray that with all beings I may reign in great multitudes and have nothing to check the unimpeded progress of truth.